So the session today is under the security track, and I think that's really important. Specifically, it involves a lot of things that have to do with security. I think more importantly, though, it has to do with automating governance. And automating governance is probably the least sexy term you're going to hear all day. It's not something that people really think about. You know, that's something that we want to do. In fact, we had a workshop yesterday. And as part of the workshop, we went through and identified what are the things that organizations have to go through in order to adopt cloud. They need an executive stakeholder that is the sponsor, that is kind of moving things forward. They need to have policies in place. They need a center of excellence to be able to build up the cloud credentials. And so we got through all these things, and then finally I said, well, we need governance after the fact. But once you get to the point when you think about needing governance, it's probably too late to go back and unwind it. So I think you're going to really enjoy what we're talking about today when it comes to AWS Organizations and the way that we can help you wrangle these multiple accounts and be able to have a better control over what you're doing within your accounts and be able to understand how to apply policies to those, be able to look at billing in a consolidated manner, and do some other stuff. So I'm going to walk you through the overall process of what the service is, how we got that service, and then James is going to come up and he's going to tell you about some really practical things that they're doing with it down at Geoscience Australia. So first of all, in your organization, how many people have one account? Okay, one person has one account. How many of you have between 2 and 10 accounts? Okay, more than 10 accounts? Wow, more than 100? More than 50? 25? Oh, I saw 50. All right, you're the winner. You get drinks first. Yes, so you're obviously here because there's an issue that you acknowledge. When you first start getting into AWS and you start creating accounts, the first thing is, wow, that's awesome. I can just take my P card out, my credit card, I can swipe it, I can spin up an account, and I'm ready to go. And that awesome lasts about 10 minutes until you realize that you have to go do that again for the next account. And then, oh, by the way, I've got to get another email address, or that purchasing card is not going to work. And so there's a lot of things that we heard from customers that said, you know what, this is really cumbersome. We're having trouble initiating new accounts, creating new accounts. We can't go in and possibly manage all of the policies that are in place with these accounts. So in order to respond to our customers' request for that, we number one, did what we should. We acknowledged that there was a problem in the way that account structures exist. We then said, what would it take to fix that? What would it take to kind of automate that? What would that service look like? So during this session, we're going to do a few things today. Number one, we're going to talk about the problem. What is it that all of these large public sector organizations have in common, things that you're going through? We're going to then talk about the answer to the problem, which is AWS Organizations. And then we're going to go over some best practices on how to apply organizations to your own account. And then ultimately, James will come up and tell you how the really cool kids are doing it. And that's always the best part, because the AWS side of things is boring. The customer side is really cool. So I think you're gonna enjoy that piece. How many of you are using AWS Organizations right now? Okay, perfect. How many of you had never even heard of organizations until 4 minutes and 30 seconds ago? Okay, good. So we've got a pretty good group here. So let's talk about how we got there. If this is an AWS account, which for these purposes, this is an AWS account, within that account, you have a couple things that you can do. One of those is you can create a user. All right, a user is simply an entity that represents an individual. So if you are a user in your account and your name is Bob Smith, then you become the user Bob Smith within that AWS account. Everybody agree with that? You're pretty familiar with what a user is and how users are created. This is very important that individuals each have their own unique user to associate with. Why is that? Well, because at one point it was so much easier and so much faster and so much more agile to just say, oh, all the developers are developer 1, and all of the admins are going to be admin 2. Well, I see some laughs out there because you know that's what happens. Well, we don't know if the admin that went in and wiped out all of your S3 buckets and deleted half of your data was Bob or Jim, because they logged in as admin 1. So make sure that your users that you have a user for each of the individuals that you have. Number 2, groups and resources. So groups, simply enough, are a collection of users. Okay? Resources, when we tend to think of resources in AWS, those are the services themselves. So you would look at EC2 as a resource, S3 is a resource, etc. Roles. Roles are an important piece of the way that we set up identity and access management within AWS, because roles allow you to do a couple of different things. Number 1, a user can assume a role. So you remember I talked about developer. You can have a developer role that establishes what rights and permissions developers are able to do. So in a given situation, let's say you have a developer role for storage. And in that role, you only want them to be able to work on EBS and S3, okay? And maybe Glacier. You can create a role that blocks everything else out so that they're not able to go into database, they're not able to spin up EC2 instances, they're not able to do all of those things, and associate that role with them. Now, another thing that you can do with that is that you can assign resources to a role, or assign a role to resources, so that you could say, okay, I want the EC2 instances with this role to be able to communicate to S3. And here's how I want them to be able to do that. That way, you're using IAM as a identity and access management to be able to pass off those permissions and not have to have your credentials flying back and forth. So the use of roles is very important as well. And then finally, policies. Policies are just that. It's a document that shows what you can and cannot do. And you can apply policies to roles, to groups, to users. Users become groups. Users can be assigned roles. Roles can be assigned to resources. And those resources, such as S3, you can actually assign a policy to S3 that gives it permission to be viewed publicly, for instance, as one of those. And then users can then use those roles. So a lot of detail went into that. Once you have the basic concepts, you're now ready for AWS Organizations. Do you have the basic concepts? Everybody good? Lots of head nodding? Okay. Now, all of this that we're doing, we're talking about AWS Accounts. And AWS Accounts proliferate for a variety of reasons. I don't know if you have used any of these as a way to get to your 25 accounts, your 50 accounts, etc. Sometimes it's an administrative boundary. We just want to say, okay, here's an account. We're going to put these resources in that. We want to make it easy to monitor. It's a mechanism for locating resources and other things. Sometimes it is resource containment. For storage, we want to have everything within a separate account that's isolated from everything else that we're doing. A billing entity, so maybe this is a large organization with different business units, or it's a large public sector organization that has different areas that we want to segregate those out. And when it comes time to bill, it's so much easier just to bill everything in this one account, charge it back to this organization, or charge it back to this cost center. So billing entity can be one of those. Environmental, production, dev, test, sandbox. A lot of organizations will have a separate account for each of those just to help keep things structured. Could be business units. I've seen workloads. Maybe your ERP system is this massive behemoth. You want to have the entire ERP system in a single account. There's no rhyme or reason to it, and because of that, you tend to see things like this. 50 accounts spread all over the place with different levels of access, all over the place. So what do you get from AWS Organizations? It says new. I know it's not a new capability. It rolled out last year at reInvent, which is our big user conference in Las Vegas. How many people have been to reInvent? 3. How many people have heard of reInvent? How many are going this year? Yeah, it's kind of a tough draw. I work exclusively in public sector, and in the States, everyone comes back when I ask that question, and they go, look, if you want public sector people to attend, don't make it in Las Vegas, and don't put pub crawl on the agenda. Then we might be able to get our supervisors to permit it. So it rolled out then. A couple of things that you get. Number one, simplified creation. So I'm going to show you, it's a very easy way to create accounts. James is going to walk you through a really quick and easy way to create accounts that doesn't involve all of the churn that you're currently undergoing. It also helps you put policies around your resources. And the last thing it does is it allows you to use simplified billing. You can access AWS Organizations through the console. You can do it through command line and API as well. Okay, so quickly, M is going to stand as your master account. Right? This is going to be where you create your organization. If you look right below that, so these 3 are going to be your dev, test, and production environments. In a second, we're actually going to title those OUs, or organizational units. So for any of you who have kind of worked in this space in an identity and access management, the terminology will be pretty much the same. Now, below that, we have what are called accounts. So A1, 2, 3, and 4. That's going to be your separate AWS accounts. Down here, we have your resources. So the resources are going to sit within an AWS account. If you think of this as an EC2 instance, that's probably a good way to think about it. So within account 1, you have, let's call it 2 EC2 instances. They sit within that account that are within the organizational unit of dev. Now, we made these up to make it super easy. Instead of organizational unit for dev, that could be administrative organizational unit A, that could be business line of business B, that could be ministry of something or other C. So it just kind of depends there, not a big deal. But what you'll do is you'll end up structuring within organization, setting up these organizational units as a hierarchical model for how to apply policies for the accounts and the resources below that. So those are done by applying what are called organizational control policies, or OCPs. Okay. Now, this one, I don't love this part of the slide because this one shows your OCP at the top in the master account. You really don't want to do that because, as we'll see, the higher up you go in the hierarchical structure, that policy is going to apply all the way down. Okay? So think about anything that you apply at the top is going to be inherited by everything below that, but it makes good for the slide, I suppose, to put it there. So the fun part, when you go to create an account, it's super easy now. You actually go into the console, you go into the command line, and you fill out really 2.5 pieces of information. Number one is an email address, and one is going to be an account name. Now, I say 2.5 because you can designate an IAM role. If you don't do that, it's optional. It will basically create a role that gives you access to everything, and then you can go back in and tweak that later. So it's really an optional piece of information. Now, the great thing about this is when you create an account within your organization, it automatically is part of that organization. Now, here's the problem. This is changing, and I've heard that it may have already changed. I need to verify it. You cannot create the account within the organization and then have it move outside of the organization. Now, why is that? Really because the benefit of creating it within the organization is the method of payment. You don't have to go in and have a new method of payment. You don't have to then go in and do the handshake to join the account. All of those things that you normally do that are pretty painful, you don't have to do that anymore. But at the same time, we still need to have the click-through agreement has to be checked off by somebody, and the method of payment does have to exist somewhere. So that's the reason why it has not typically been you've not typically been able to move an account outside of the organization. Now, you can invite an account that exists outside of your organization into it. It's very easy. You go into the console, you type in either the account number or the email address associated with it. You'll send an invite. It'll pop up. Now, to accept the invite, you actually will have to be in the console to accept it. You can't just do it via email, which is another form of control. You want to make sure that they have access to be able to do that. But once you've invited someone, you can actually kick them out. So that's a neat thing, is that if you invite an account into the organization, you can easily move them back out. So can you have embedded OUs? Can you have OUs that hang off of OUs? Absolutely. I think you can go about 5 deep. That, for some people, is overkill. You wouldn't need to do that. But one thing you cannot do is have an account that exists in 2 separate OUs, in 2 separate organizations, I'm sorry. So if it's located within one organization, it can't exist inside of another one. Taking a look at the policy, so if we assume that the green at the top is a policy, where is that policy going to apply? Any ideas? Just to dev? Just to test? Nope. It's going to go all the way down. But if we assume that this blue one is a policy in account 3, it's only going to apply to the resources that are applicable within that account. So taking this method, you can see that if you apply a resource, apply a policy in your account at the top, it's going to go all the way down. Now, interestingly enough, if you take that policy and you say, okay, I'm going to move this account from test into prod, you can see what happens there. The policy that's in place here stays with the account, because that's where you applied that policy. A policy that is attached to the production environment then flows down. So here's an interesting thing and a reason why you'd want to do that. Think about automating compliance. So when we think about health compliance, a lot of the work that I do with hospitals and healthcare agencies in the United States requires HIPAA. HIPAA is not supported, or every AWS service is not supported by HIPAA, right? We don't want to be out of compliance when it comes to people's personal health records that are out there. So an easy thing to do is say, okay, this production environment is HIPAA environment. We're going to go through and we're going to block, or actually we're going to just allow all of the APIs that have to do with HIPAA. Nothing else can be permitted. That means that any account that is moved under my HIPAA production environment is not even going to be able to access any of the resources that aren't HIPAA compliant. That's one of the ways that you can maintain that compliance and ensure that those things are going to be there. So no matter what accounts you move in and out, you're always going to be guaranteed of that compliance as long as that organizational unit, that organizational control policy is in place. So there's 2 ways of doing that. One is whitelisting, one is blacklisting. Don't do both. Don't do both simply because whitelisting, you're actually saying, here's the APIs that are allowed, and blacklisting is you're doing the opposite, saying here's the ones that are going to be blocked. So for instance, you might want to say you can put an object, but you can't delete an object. You can look at a certain API, but you can't terminate that API. So there's things like that you want to do. Plan from the start for the way that you're going to use these service control policies, these organizational control policies, and be very very prescriptive with the way that you do those. They can't be overridden by a local administrator. So the higher up you go when you're applying these policies, the better off you are. And then the last thing I'm going to add is that it's really important to understand that your IAM policies, Identity Access Management, and your service control policies are going to both work as long as they don't step on each other, okay? So think of IAM as what happens within the account, within the resources and the users within the account, and the service control policies is what happens outside of the account, okay? So an easy way to do that is to say, first of all, let's say we're going to whitelist. All right, we're going to whitelist EC2 star and S3 star. That means anything having to do with spinning up an instance, creating a bucket, putting objects in buckets, all of those things are going to be applicable. But if we blacklist, we're going to blacklist SQS star, meaning you're not going to be able to do anything with the SQS service. Okay? So the SCP is going to say, allow EC2 star, allow S3 star. On the other side, identity and access management for that individual, let's call it a user, is going to say, we're going to allow EC2 star, we're going to allow SQS star. Okay, so everything with SQS and everything with EC2. Now, because one of those is an IAM policy, fully in effect, and because this one here is a service control policy, fully in effect, what's going to happen when you merge them? Does that make sense? This individual in this, working in the resources in this account, will be allowed to do anything they want to do with EC2. If they're allowed under an IAM policy to S3 star, then that would move under there as well. But under the current area where these two come together, that's not possible. Now, finally is simplified billing. So as part of this, all of the consolidated billing that you're probably already using is automatically going to be rolled into organizations. So if you're not currently taking advantage of that, you'll be able to do it here. This is kind of the billing on steroids, right? The moving forward to the consolidated billing plus service control policies. So there are two modes of organizations. One of them is billing mode, where essentially it's a great way to look at the billing from all of the different accounts, but you don't actually have policy access to do things within the accounts. And the other one is going to be the full control mode. And that's going to give you the mode where you can do that. You define that mode at the beginning, so think very carefully about that. Right there, full mode, consolidated billing. So I'm going to flip through these. I always tell people don't take pictures, but now I'm going to encourage you to if you want to have these because we're running out of time. But just quickly to go through, make sure you're using CloudTrail. That records all of the API calls that are happening within the account so that you can monitor what's going on. Use least privilege, so only grant access that's required. Always test this out on a single account. Make sure that it's the policies that you want. Don't just bring things in willy-nilly. Avoid whitelisting and blacklisting. Pick one or the other. Go with it. Always create new accounts for the right reasons. Familiarize yourself with service limits. Some of those have hard limits. Some of them are very soft. VPCs per region, things like that can be changed. And then when you're using IAM, most of these are really nice. So if you go into IAM, there's kind of a tick box for a lot of these that kind of show you whether or not you're doing the best practices. Having a strong password, creating individual IAM users, removing the use of root, enabling MFA for all of the accounts, etc. So make sure that when you're using organizations that you're planning things out, you understand what you're hoping to accomplish, what it is that you're trying to provide. Understand how accounts, users, groups, policies, and resources all work together. Remember those best practices that I just flew through so you could take a picture. And call to action is really plan out with your organization what it is you're trying to accomplish, what access needs to happen, what compliance needs to occur, and figure out how you can automate that using AWS Organizations. It takes a lot of the overhead out of managing your accounts, your billing, and your compliance. And it allows you to do things like the cool stuff that James and Geoscience Australia talked about without having to put a lot of time and effort into the overall management of it. Thank you very much. Enjoy your cocktails.